Blog Talk Radio.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio. Now, here's your host, Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Good evening, everyone. I am Michael Anthony Ingram. My special guest tonight is acclaimed poet Sandra Yannone. Sandra is not only a first-class poet, she's also one of the organizers of the Facebook group Cultivating Voices Live Poetry. She hosts the group's weekly live forum on Sundays, a must-attend event via Zoom. There's so much I can say about Sandy, but all I'll say is hello, Sandy. How are you tonight?
Michael, it is such an absolute joy to be with you and our audience tonight. It's really like a dream. I've been with you once before here,
yes.
And to return is remarkable. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I am so pleased. Let's begin this journey together, okay?
Absolutely.
What is poetry, Sandy?
You know, poetry, to me, I studied in college a seminar on Robert Frost. And one of the things that Robert Frost, of course, was famous for saying, that poetry was a stay against confusion. And I really tend to think of poetry like as a movement toward understanding, of like the deepest understanding that connects, of course, with what you do, Michael, quintessential listening. Poetry is as much about listening as it is about anything else. It's connected to healing and community. And so all those ways that folks might think of it as in a kind of academic realm, I think it's of the most primal human realm, and that does connect us to listening to one another. That's what poetry
very
is
nice.
to me.
Very, very nice. So in the world that we live in, and maybe you've already answered this question, why is it important? Maybe I just want you to go a little deeper.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning Cultivating Voices Live Poetry, the program that I host once a week. I have really learned through that work that poetry is such a significant way for us to connect with each other through our humanity. It's like we're a thread line with each other. I just am in constant amazement that I get to hear people share their most secret and most urgent things that they need to say. And poetry is so important because I've been watching it provide that opportunity for people to access their feelings, their emotions, their stories, their associations. The things that matter most to them are what I think poetry can hold and can achieve when we bring people together in that endeavor. So that is why it is so important, and I've never felt that more. As a person who's been studying poetry for a long time, I've never felt poetry's importance more than during the pandemic.
You know, it's so funny. I think people often underestimate the power of hearing, of listening. And I'm glad you talked about the quintessential piece of that. But I also believe that you're right. During the pandemic, things have changed so much, so much, Sandy. Any other comments?
Radically.
All right. Well, let me ask this question. What
Sure.
are some of the predominant themes of your work?
I have 4 kind of cardinal points that my work really touches on. And those are silence, which would be the breaking of silence predominantly, disaster, desire, and hope. They work together in a very interesting constellation in that I believe that when we're silent is when we experience our most, the deepest of the disasters, our own personal disasters. But the word disaster literally means to turn away from the star. That's what the word disaster means. And when we make that turn, it's a turn toward a desire for something that we didn't believe we could imagine when we were in that space of disaster. And once you can desire again is when you can start to hope. And so I believe that my work really explores those 4 themes.
All right. Well, please share one of your works.
Well, this is a poem that I wrote in a coffee shop in Lincoln, Nebraska, not recognizing at the time that it would feel so emblematic of what it was like for me to continue to be a woman in this dominant culture of America. And it's called What the Woman Who Doesn't Measure Will Do. The ruler's little slashes form a ladder she will not climb. The shadow of a shadow forming on the steps themselves, the light, the river that should keep still. She dives underwater. Her hands retrieve many stones, small bodies she piles on the bank when she returns for air. Later, she will throw each cold stone back against the pane of all the windows she's wanted to break. They will sink farther from her than the first time they sank. Unattended, the moon burrows into the blue. Far away, she says, as if no instrument could fathom such distance. Thank you.
Very powerful. Very powerful. How does a poem ordinarily begin for you? With an idea, a form, or an image?
I often hear a small voice in my head that is driving me toward an image. And then sometimes I will get that first line, and then I'll feel driven to write that first line down. And the form comes pretty quickly after that, but I'm very much driven by, I would say, image, and then the line, and then the music. I really start to hear how I want a poem to sound in my head, and that's how I revise. So, but the image is what drives it, and I can talk a little bit more about that around some of the poems when I read them as well, to share how that works.
All right, very nice. As you think about poetry and your early beginnings, what was an early experience where you learned that poetic language had power? Secondly, do you come from a literary background?
I don't think of myself as coming from a literary background. My folks did not attend college. However, in my household, my dad was always playing music, and my mom, unbeknownst to me, had written lots of poetry when she was young. And one day, I ended up going into my mother's desk and finding a journal or something. And I read this poem that was about the stars. It was, astronomy, the constellations. And when I read it, I actually felt like I was reading one of my own poems. It was the eeriest thing. I thought, oh, how did this poem of mine get here? And then realized, oh, my mother had written that in high school. And it sounded so much like my voice when I started writing poetry in high school. And so I don't think of myself as coming from a literary background, but I think of my family as really influencing the significance of my own literacy ever since I've been a little girl.
And the poem reminded you of you.
It did. It was eerie. I thought I'd written it, and I had to do a double take because it sounded so much like what I knew that I had been kind of writing myself at that time when I was in high school, and the cadence and the line lengths and everything like eerily seemed like my own voice, but it wasn't. It was my mother's. And that reminds me a little bit of an Elizabeth Bishop poem in The Waiting Room, when she hears her aunt's voice in her head, that little O of pain. It was Aunt Consuelo's voice. But then Bishop goes on to say, but actually it was my voice. I was my aunt. I was that timid, foolish woman. And in that moment, my moment with my mother's voice in front of me on the page, I felt like I became my mother in that moment, and that she became me, because she never got to write the way I've been able to write, and to share her work the way I've been able to share my work. And so there's a mutuality to that I always hold very, very dear to my heart, that when I think about that particular poem of my mother's. And my father's gone on in later life to also write some poetry, and so it's been very interesting. It's been a very interesting journey, not coming from what would traditionally be thought of as a very literary family, but one that certainly has valued the written word.
One last point on that. What do you think you learned about your mother from that experience, from finding her journal?
Our mother, I think so many of us have have these myths about our parents. And
yes, so true.
And I learned really in that moment that my mother had aspirations beyond just what I thought she was doing, which was trying to raise me, and she wasn't working at the time when I would have kind of been that age, and that she had something that she felt she needed to say, and that she needed to share, but she didn't have an audience. And so the page became her audience. And there's something that made me appreciate far more deeply the fact that I have an audience, and also a sadness, really, that she wasn't able to find a way to break the silence off of the page, beyond the page for her. But in that moment, that was enough. And
yes.
To have discovered it later was quite remarkable. And so now I understand how much she appreciates poetry. I mean, she listens to Cultivating Voices, the program,
yes.
all the time. And I really learned how much she influenced me in a way that I could never have appreciated without actually seeing that poem.
That's why poetry is so important, Sandy.
Absolutely, yep.
Because it can build bridges where you never thought that you needed a bridge.
And it always continues, and it continues in the way that a family is constructed. You know, we have all the stories of what goes on in our families, and it's not always pretty, obviously.
True.
But
yes.
within my family, knowing my mother's capacity to love and appreciate poetry, it is an unbreakable bond between us.
Let's take a brief break.
It is
and
just
we'll be right back.
the thing that holds us together.
Yes, we'll be right back. I'm here with Sandra Yannone. You don't know how pleased I am, people out there. You don't know how pleased I am to have Sandra on the program. You don't know it. You know, with Cultivating Voices, every week, Sandy, every week, does writing, does hosting energize or exhaust you?
Honestly, it truly exhilarates me. It's the highlight of my week. Anything that had been going on during the rest of the week kind of falls away. There's an anticipation of knowing that the unknown is about to happen. There's an alchemy. There's another world that will get created in that 60 to 90 minutes, and that even if I know who's going to be reading, and many times I don't, because it's sometimes there's an open mic, so it is a complete surprise. But even if I know the theme, I know the poets, I likely know some of the poetry that's going to show up, I never ever can anticipate what will happen in the combination of voices as they merge and talk with each other and talk to the audience, that's listening. And that is something to marvel. And I've never, you were telling me today that this is 189th guest. We've had hundreds of people come on, and I'm always, I'm as excited as I was, although maybe not as nervous as I was from the very first time we did it on March 20th, 29th, 2020. It's really never lost. It's glitter. It's magic. It's magic, Michael. Poetry is magic. Holding that space is magic.
Speaking of magic, please share another poem. Well,
since I said the word magic, I'm going to take you to the second series in the book that I've written, Boats for Women, and some poems about and in the voice of Beth Houdini, the wife and partner of the acclaimed magician Harry Houdini. This poem is Beth Houdini recalls the curtain in the modern world. Sometimes the hall window holds the echo of your face. It overrules the dark, and the applause, like glass breaking, returns. We're together again, propped behind the curtain, waiting for the cloth to rise and bunch to take our bows. Your left hand picks the same lock in my back each night to rest upon. Sometimes, here, after all the defiances, I feel alone and grope for the woman left rusting in the drapery like an abandoned key. I hear the stage's edge call, my feet easily wanting the drop, and the crowds, their hands on all the unrehearsed places. Harry, you set out to disillusion the world. Is this why the window loves you? Thank you.
You know, all great writers have great writing influences. Who are some of yours, and what makes them great in your eyes?
Well, there are so many that I could mention. I'm going to take the ones that I constantly go back to, which is not to minimize anyone that I've read once that has touched me or a number of times. I'm very, very influenced by the poet Elizabeth Bishop, Marie Howe, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, and another poet that I go back to time and time again is Lee Young Lee. For very, very different reasons. I feel like with Bishop I really learned about image and line and that the microscopic and wanting to like stay in the moment. And I also love her use of forms. I mean, there isn't a better villanelle in the world than One Art, as far as I'm concerned. And I just continue to go back to her time and time again for also her insight about what it means to become a person in the world. I'm thinking about like her poem The Fish, where she catches a tremendous fish and then she lets it go. That's the first line and the last line, but everything in between is this delicious, unimaginable description of the fish, which creates a story between a human and a fish in a way that we realize that both parties are worthy of being together and worthy of life together. It's a remarkable poem, and that poem in the waiting room that I mentioned before, yes, of hers, that moment when she realizes that she could be anybody. I love her turns of phrases. Audre Lorde, I appreciate because of her bold, bold strength of spirit, and everything that she has written about just inspires me to, as she says, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. I think I've been a person afraid of so many things for most of my life, and Audre Lorde reminds me, your silence will not protect you, and be in the service of your vision. And so I'll stop there with those two, but there's so many.
So Audre Lorde released you from your fear through her work.
Yeah, absolutely. Reading her essays and her poetry, particularly the essays in Sister Outsider, really encouraged me. I was at the time I was just coming out as lesbian, and
yes.
Reading her work encouraged me. And this was a number of years ago, when it wasn't really still that safe to be writing poems from a lesbian, gay, bisexual perspective. The T and the Q weren't even in the lexicon yet, right? Mm-hmm. And she and her essays, her dialogues with Adrienne Rich, the communities that she built, just inspired me to say, okay, I get it. My silence really won't protect me. Keep writing.
Well, speaking of writing, some poets claim that a poem is like a living creature. Once it's out there, there's not much you can do to correct or improve it, while others edit meticulously, not leaving much from the original draft form. What is your take on it?
I'm so obsessive about line breaks. I'm incredibly obsessive about line breaks. I am not of the mind that a poem is fixed only in its moment of creation. I think there's so much to learn from the process of revision that goes well beyond the process of the poem. I mean, for me, it's a little bit like climbing a ladder. I learn something about the poem, I revise it, I learn something about myself as a writer in the process of revising, I learn something about the poem again. I love the reciprocity that comes with revision, and enjoy the initial rapture of starting a poem, but there is something deeply satisfying and, dare I say, like raucous or luxurious or both, about continuing to dive back under the waterline of a poem and see what else can surface. And for me, that's often in figuring out, well, what's the form going to take, because I don't usually start out writing in a form. It usually comes out as like a wild burst of words, and then I try to sculpt, I attempt to sculpt it in a way, and that sculpting, particularly through the line and the line break, is what really gets me jazzed.
Okay. Well, jazz us with another poem.
All right. I'm gonna share with you a poem that's a sestina, and because I wanted to share a poem that began, as I talked about, sometimes for me, I'll start with that image, or I'll hear that word in my head, and the impulse to write will take over me. And this is what happened with this particular poem that takes place in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, the night of the shooting. So I want to give a little bit of a content warning here in that regard. But this poem started with me hearing a line, and I'll share with you what it is when I'm done with the poem. And then I had to immediately go to the poem, and I did know it was going to be a festina. I did know that, which is not always how it works. This is called Requiem for Orlando. I am struggling now to comprehend my pulse, how I still have one, after all the opportunities I've had to die by my own hands, with too many drinks downed in bars, then driving while I waited to become my uncloseted self. And now I have nothing to do but pulse with crackling rage while I raise an empty glass, mourning the fact that you, Orlando, lost so many hearts, lips, and hands, all wanting to give back something to the other hearts that beat like hell on that dance floor before the clock struck 1. You alive, you raising your drinks to the glassy air, you raising your brown Orlando hands to the heavens in the heat of your last night at Pulse. And of course you don't know this. Don't know that death is waiting around the corner like a drunk in a car as you wait for last call. Your early morning heart drums faster to keep perfect time with its perfect pulse as it moves closer to each body on the dance floor, to the one you will leave this world with tonight, with your hands locked tight, pressing each other's calloused palms, your glassy eyes looking forward to the next time you raise them like a glass. Clutch them in the grace of everything that the body waits to release when it releases itself from the tenuous grip of hands in the act. And doesn't your Orlando always resemble the heart, restless, resilient, eager to demonstrate how it is one with the divine, how it yearns to live from within its own pulse? And now I am pondering the woman who sat next to me, our pulses quickening on my porch steps before we kissed, then shuffled our hearts back into the deck to hide in the shadows of the one true thing I know that I have been waiting to discover with another. And now all the broken drinking glasses resemble diamonds on the dance floor, and a pair of smeared sunglasses rests on the floor of the massacre's aftermath, inside and outside of Pulse. Orlando, the world will wake up Sunday morning with news of your murdered hearts. And in the 5th stanza, I've dropped a line in shock. My hands go cold from grief. I don't know if I can spare to wait for the one who could be the one, while everyone in Orlando is one dance step away from their hearts shattering like blown glass floats, that hands once held precious, waiting for love to pulse. Yes, pulse. And still I have one. Thank you.
What can I say? What can I say? What can I say? That was so powerful. The emotions, wow. Do you think someone can be called a poet if they don't feel strong emotions?
Wow, it is such a reeling, telling, revealing, and question. I think that poetry is a way of seeing, feeling, sensing, experiencing, hearing. You know, of course, I'm going to use your word, Michael. Listening to the world, and I do, and in that regard, I think that strong emotions are the stuff that poetry is made of. I believe that everyone has poetry in them because everyone has feelings in them, and they have strong emotions. So in that regard, I'm going to say everyone can tap into and tackle that place, but you've got to find the divining rod that reaches inside yourself to do it.
Do you think that you live your life like a poem, like it's a poem?
For better or for worse, and everything in between. I do recognize that I likely walk through the world a little differently than some of other people that I know, because I'm looking with curiosity for the image, for the thing that is going to unlock something that I didn't know before. And in that regard, now I can't do that every minute of the day, but I'd like to be able to. I mean, I really would like to be able to. And that is for me, that is my best self, is when I'm able to move through the world that way.
Do you think you were meant to be a poet?
I love your question. I love your question so much. I just need to tell you that. I hope people tell you that often.
Well, that's why they pay the big bucks.
I'm gonna say the blasphemous thing, and I think I really wanted to be a painter like my grandmother.
Oh, wow.
And I know. I really loved painting when I was young, and I painted with my grandmother. I'm kind of surprised I didn't become a painter. I guess it's not too late, and I suppose that there's a way that I paint, with the line.
Yes.
But I was told another time that photography, that I was a pretty strong photographer. But here's the thing about me: I'm a poet out of stubbornness more than anything else, and I just decided that that's what I wanted to do as a writer, was to be a poet, not a fiction writer, not an essayist. I love all those genres, but against other advice, I said, no, poetry is the thing I want to do. And but I don't know that I'm only meant to be what I'm meant, where I am. And so
yes.
Here I am.
Wow.
Here I am.
So eloquently stated. Oh, I like that. That put a smile on my face. I like that. Please share another poem. Share another poem.
Sure. Well, let's take you to another place kind of near and dear to my heart, which is some aspects of history. I have a deep appreciation for the Titanic disaster of 1912, and the first section of my debut collection, Boats for Women, is about many different maritime disasters, but predominantly features the Titanic. So this is the title poem. Boats for Women. Yes, the boat sank. Yes, it broke in two like a stereotypical heart before it plummeted to depths no one could measure until 70 years later technology caught up and looked its ancestor in the face. Yes is the way the years oxidize the steel, and yes wipes the name Titanic off the bow. Yes are the lifeboats, the davits, the call for women and children first. Yes are the men who cry from the decks. Sometimes when I kiss her, I am leaving a yes on her lips to let her know I will go down with this ship. Sometimes when she whispers yes, we are staying on board. But there is always room in the lifeboats for 2 more women. Yes is the fact that if we were alive on that night, we would have lived. Thank you.
Wow. Again, what do I say? You know, when I think about your work and I think about the titles of your poems, in my mind, they're very detailed, very specific. What role should a title play for a poem?
If I could give the quintessential answer to this, like I'd be able to like retire right now, like everybody, you know, because this is it. Like, what is the function of a title? I mean, it can take on so many things, but for me, I want it to be a crack in the door. And you know, like a slight open of the Pandora's box. You know, it should provoke you into curiosity of what's about to follow, and yet not tell everything. Do not reveal everything. One of the things that I like best about the cover to my book, Boats for Women, is that the cover has neither a boat nor a woman on the cover. And it for me, I thought that was genius on the part of the designer, because it leads you into wondering, okay, well then, where are all the boats? Where are all the women? Like, what does this mean as we're looking at the swirl of purple water on the cover? And I think that I think that a good title should lead us down a path that we couldn't imagine, and yet when we finish the poem, it feels crystal clear that, well, of course that was the title. Of course that was the magic door that led us in. They're not easy to do by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I'm sure. Please share another poem.
Well, as I've mentioned to you throughout this absolutely delightful time, I do love history. And so I'm going to share another poem that takes us all the way back to 1892.
Okay.
I got a little obsessed with a friend of mine had written a poem about Lizzie Borden, and she kind of dared me to go and write one of my own. And so I did, and it's what I call a fractured sonnet. If you were to see it, it's actually 28 lines, because I broke each line in half to create this illusion of hatchets. And the poem is called All the Hatchets. Borden residence, Fall River, Massachusetts. August 1892. The police, after I summoned for help, appeared to wait with me for a break in the case. In my parlor, they apologetically hounded me with insinuations masked as questions before the wounds on my father's face had time to cake dry. We all made mistakes that blistering August day. I remained a woman alone because no one saw me awake with a man. They believed in all the hatchets they'd found dismembered in my basement, evidence resounding that I took the blade to flesh multiple times downstairs and up. I could not debate their suppositions any more than my deflated muscles could release their powers to a blunt instrument. I ask what you might have accomplished in those implausible hours, with all the words in your mouth, a confession of gravel you wished to spit to the planked parlor floor, your creased forehead unveiling its worry in the mirror's glass. What would you do to ignite your innocence if from the couch in the other room your father's one good dead eye continued its duress? Thank you.
On that note, let's take a brief break. We'll be right back. That was so powerful, Sandy. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
We are back. I am here with the amazing Sandra Yannone. You know, they say that to see the world with complete honesty, one should look to comedians, artists, and poets. What do you think emerges naturally from your work, Sandra? What emerges from you?
I love humor, and I love wit. And I love joy. I don't always, but I think that I am always looking in my poems for like that slight, that turn toward hope that I mentioned earlier before. I mean, my poems are often take us to the kind of the sad, the grief-stricken, the forlorn, the ravaged, the confused, and want to make sense of something. To make that turn back toward. It's the turn away it's the turn back toward the light. It's that turn I talked about in Disaster, the turn away from the star, back to some semblance of hope. And I also think that comedians do that as well. When I really think about it, I think that they're doing something similar. I mean, I haven't studied comedy in that deeply, but I listened for a long time to Jerry Seinfeld's program, comedians with cars and with coffee in cars or something like that, and the way that the comedians talked about their craft had a kind of sublimeness that I feel like poets talk about around their craft. It was really quite interesting. So,
you know, writers and poets write for a myriad of reasons. Some write primarily to speak a message to the audience, while others write to not stay silent because that's not an option. What do you write? Why do you write?
Well, when I mentioned Audre Lorde earlier, you know, I definitely hearkened on that very necessary urge to, you know, to break the glass of silence. You know, it takes a fire, breaks glass, and I think that's what I'm attempting to do for myself first, and if I'm lucky, if I'm fortunate, my breakthrough in a poem, if I'm able to achieve it, can serve as a breakthrough for the person listening. And I realize that it may be different breakthroughs. The reason that I'm trying to break through might not be how a poem supports a listener in breaking through, but I'm okay with that. But it does start, I think, with my own reckoning and speaking something that seems beyond my reach of understanding, but something that I feel desperate to come to terms with.
You know, Sandy, I hear an echo. I hear an echo.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you can hear it. Are you there?
Now. Yes.
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay. All right then. Speaking of reckoning, we're going through so much in this world, Sandy. So much. There's so much. There's a lot of good things, but there are also a lot of things that need to be addressed. What do you view as being the role of a poet in modern day society?
I'm taking a very deep pause because it's a very it's a heavy question. You know, as I said, week after week, month after month through the pandemic, through people having personal crises, and also in the United States, the reckoning around Black Lives Matter, but around trans issues, LGBTQ issues, immigrant rights, poverty, anything that is suppressing, oppressing, is what is necessary to be spoken in a poem. You know, to open that throat to not just a song, but a cry. Often it's a cry.
Wow.
And your program provides the ability for people to sing and cry, and to share those utterances that are so necessary that if we do not hear them, I do not think that as a species we can survive if we do not continue to listen and truly hear those cries and take action. Now, poetry is an action, but it requires more action. but poetry is one way to strike the match.
Incredible. I am having so much fun listening to
I
you.
am too.
I really am. I feel like I'm in a class. I'm learning so much. Thank you. What do you view as being a measure of success as a poet?
You know, I had a student contact me today of I had done a reading in New Hampshire about 3 years ago, and this young poet contacted me out of the blue to say, I had your book a few years ago. I forgot about it, and I picked it up, and I remembered how much I appreciated and felt like the poems influenced how I thought about writing my own work. For me, poetry for me is about inviting others to speak their truth. That to me is the greatest gift that I can provide as a poet, and that's what I think the measure of a poet is how much they open up others to the world of poetry. So it's not like, do I have a great body of work? It's that in the moment, if one of my poems speaks to you or to you or to you, mm-hmm. As Audre Lorde says, I'm doing my work, and that's what I think the genuine work of a poet is. It goes back to that oral tradition of the bards, just
yes.
reciting their work, hoping someone would listen. It always comes back to that listening part for me. If someone is listening.
Well, when you think back to finding your mother's poetry to now, how has your idea of what poetry is and what poetry can do changed since you began this journey? Now, that's a big question. I know it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. You don't shy from the big, like, vital, quintessential questions. There it is.
You make me laugh.
One of my I'm gonna answer your question, Michael. Don't worry, I'm gonna answer your question. But I also want to just say one of my favorite episodes, and there have been many, because I love the program. I don't call in. I never call in. I'm gonna call in sometime, but I just listen. I loved when you interviewed Kate Wedgerson, and you two had such a rapport together on the radio that evening, or streaming, and because she is a poet who has not always had like the confidence to allow herself to think of herself as a poet and to share her poetry. And what I think about, it's your laugh. It was your laugh that prompted me to remember that. The two of you laughed so much on that program. I loved it. But what does poetry, how has poetry changed over, every single time I hear someone read a poem, I hope I am open to interesting to considering how poetry can change me. So that I think it's been a lifelong process of actually not staying fixed in, I have to write a poem that sounds or looks or feels like X and stay in X. X does not mark the spot. Poetry for me is about how do you depart and arrive somewhere. And so I hope I'm changed every single time I encounter, every single time I sit down to write a poem, and every single time I hear someone share a poem. And again, I feel like every single week I've been so fortunate to have that happen on Cultivating Voices, and frankly all the other poetry readings that I've gone to online and attended and or listened to. Poetry remains deeply, purely, and it's quintessentially, it's like one of my favorite words. I use it all the time because I've taken it from you. It is quintessentially about listening. So for me, how can I continue to change through listening? Poetry for me is that medium. And so I've changed because of the way that poetry is able to change through every different person that I listen to, wherever they are in the world.
We've reached the end of our journey together. We've reached the end.
Quite a journey tonight.
Quite a journey. Quite a journey.
Quite a journey.
Quite a journey. What's next for you, Sandra? What's next for you? Where do you go from here?
I've been working on my second collection, which is almost complete, called The Glass Studio. My parents are stained glass artists, but the next project that I'm starting to dive into to work it's an erasure project of a book written about the Titanic. I'm going to go back. I'm going to dive back into the wreck, as Adrienne Rich writes about diving into the wreck. And I'm doing an erasure of an entire book called A Night to Remember to produce a series of poems. I'm not sure if it'll be one long poem or consider it a series, but that's my next project. And, of course, listening to all the poets, always listening to the poets. So going to as many readings as I can.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been on a roller coaster tonight. Oh, wow. Silence, disaster, desire, and hope. See, I take notes, Sandy. I take notes.
Oh, I knew you were listening, Michael. I had no doubt.
Yes, I was listening. If I don't do anything else, I'm going to listen. I want to thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, with your work, with your wisdom. I can't wait for the Sundays to get a chance to see you again.
I love seeing you every Sunday, and thank you for all that you do, Michael, to hold the space for poetry, change, and also hope.
Well, on that note, I say to you again, thank you. I want to thank our listening audience, and as I share every week, let poetry ring.
You have just listened to the Quintessential Listening Poetry Online Radio Podcast with your host, Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher. And make sure to catch our next episode.